as referring to the extended family of African communalism, and second, the reference to the creation of agricultural collectives known as Ujamaa villages. The relation between the two is that the Ujamaa village seek to recapture the principles of joint production, egalitarian distribution, and universal obligation to work which were found within African communalism. In the present decisions of World Ujamaa incorporates both of these meanings and includes also the implication of several policy documents and public plans. And what are we doing? Hello, everybody. We're just coming in. Hello. Just checking back just a little bit. Boom, 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 boom. A necessary piece of ground clearing must be performed by advancing the negative proposition of Tanzania Ujamaa is not African socialism, quote unquote. Such a disclaimer may appear curious and even presumptuous in a view of the fact that in 1962, Muwalamua Nyerere referred to Ujamaa as, quote, the basis of African socialism, end quote. But there are several reasons for keeping the two concepts widely apart. When, quote, African socialism, end quote, was in vogue early in the 1960s, it comprised a variety of interpenetrations, ranging from a wish to see a socialist society in Africa to a desire to maintain the status quo of neocolonialism. Since then, the term has come to be identified with its most consistent and least revolutionary ideologue, Leopold Senghor, and with the late Tom Mwambi. As such, quote, African socialism, end quote, is generally taken to mean a set of relations which leave capitalism and imperialism unchanged. It is therefore essential to disassociate the anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist stance in Tanzania from a caption that has been preempted by non-revolutionary African leaders. Furthermore, when Ujamaa was presented as an option shortly after the independence of Tanganyika, it was knowingly defined as an abstract set of values without reference to the social forms necessary for their realization. Much has now been done in the way of policy decisions to indicate and build the relevant social structures, whereby further differentiating Ujamaa from its erstwhile counterparts of African socialism, insofar as the latter never advanced from the ideal to the real. Above all, one must take more of a progressive evolution of Tanzanian theory and practice over a period of nearly a decade as a positive response to national, African, and international development. Controversially, to associate Ujamaa with the category of, quote, scientific socialism seems to be flying in the face of assertions to the contrary by Tanzanian policymakers. Scientific socialism is held to be synonymous with Marxism, communism, and the like, which have been held at arm's length by Tanzanians who propound Ujamaa. The contradiction is more apparent than real. In part, it disappears when one takes into account the above-mentioned factors of significance, political ideological advance from the Ashura Declaration to Mwanganzo. In addition, the more decisively the difference is largely based on a caricature of scientific socialism, Marxism, which which purposes that socialism must come through proletarian revolution within an already developed capitalist state. Such a definition would automatically exclude Tanzania Ujamaa, which looks towards the socialist organization of peasants and seeks to revive the I don't know this word, which revise and perpetuate the collective principles of production and the egalitarian nature of distribution which characterizes communalism, as carried out both by some self-professed Marxists and by bourgeoisie analysts. The transformation of Marxism into a barren, dogmatic, mechanistic, and unidimensional theory has understandably led many creative individuals to reject what purports to be scientific socialism. To reopen the issue, one must go back to first principles and rescue the essence of scientific socialism. Socialism emerged as an ideology within capitalist society. All of its exponents saw the viciousness of capitalism and agreed on the need for replacing the prevailing production of private profit with the system which met the needs of all. However, they did not agree on neither the precise content of socialist society or the means by which it was to be instituted. It is in this area that the necessity arose from the distinguishing between unrealistic socialist hopes and a more rigorous analysis that could claim to meet the canons of scientific methods and which by its correctness guarantees meaningful action for the realization of socialism. For Marx, quote, scientific socialism is quite simply socialism that is scientific. St. Simons, Owens, Fourier, and others, those are all like socialist utopians, pioneer socialists of the early 19th centuries were duped utopian by Marx and Engels for the variety of reasons, notably because they failed to appreciate that human social development proceeded through certain stages and because the model socialist societies did not take cognizance and the reality of class struggle. On the other hand, the rubric, quote, scientific socialism still attaches the mode of perception which predicts the emergence of socialism as a product of the dialectic movement of all previous history, and that's historical materialism, and as a consequence of the triumph of the working class. Utopian socialism, or at least utopian elements in socialist thought, have persisted and reappeared from time to time. Quote, African socialism is utopian in its refusal to grips with class relations in which Africans are enmeshed and in the romanticized ignorance of the strategy of African history development. It is the contention of the author that, in contrast, Tanzania Ujamaa is correct in its perception of the principal motion of its own society. The assertion that, quote, there is no class in Africa, end quote, is often used to justify capitalist investment in the commitment, and in recent times it has come under criticism from progressive African thinkers. First, it must be noted that the international character of capitalist production in the era of imperialism has placed the propertied class in the metropoles, while the greater proportion of their working force resides in the colonial or semi-colonial areas. Second, the colonial sectors show varying degrees of stratification and class formations as a consequence of their integration in the international capitalist economy. Both of these features are recognized in the Tanzanian policy documents, which elaborate on the theory of Ujamaa, Tenu's Ashura Declaration, and Mwalimu Nyereri's socialism and rural development being the most relevant. The Ashura Declaration had little to say about the development of socialism in the countryside beyond expressing the opinion that concern for the peasant farmer must be a priority. However, this document set the stage for the policy of constructing Ujamaa villages by expropriating the foreign capitalist class, who until then were owners of the major means of production within Tanzania. And it stated unequivocally that the major means of production are under the control of the ownership of the peasants and the workers themselves through their government and their cooperatives. Nationalization and the acquisition of part ownership of several companies were steps in the direction of severing the links between the local working class and the international bourgeoisie. The Ashura Declaration also states that socialism was incompatible with the presence of capitalist elements, in contrast with, quote, African socialism, which has as one of its major tenets the advocacy of coexistence of private and public ownership. Utopian socialists promote the models in which capitalists cooperated with their workers in the new society. They sometimes assigned a major initiatory role to the bankers. Senghor's proposal was to socialize agriculture, to establish public utilities as a mixed sector, and to leave banks, commerce, and industry to the capitalist enterprise. The sum total of these arrangements would be, quote, African socialism. Insofar as contemporary theory and practice of Ujamaa in Tanzania does allow for private enterprises, this is well understood to be transitional and an entirely different concept from that of the permanent coexistence of capitalist and supposedly socialist relations within same societies, the one that has been implemented in every socialist revolution from 1917 onwards. Both feudalists and capitalists are cited by the Ashura Declaration as enemies of socialism. The former had their place in the scheme of things in Africa before the coming of the Europeans, while the latter came into being as part of the process by being metropolitan capitalist societies was remodeling colonial society, wittingly and unwittingly along lines of stratification and exploitation. The Indian businessman in East Africa were closest representation of the locally resident bourgeoisie. It is no accident that they were the most affected by the measures of expropriation behind the nationalizations of foreign-owned property. Oh my gosh, this is a huge thing. That is by the acquisition of the Buildings Act, 1971. Thus, both ideological statements and the government policy pointed that within Tanzania there were capitalist and feudalist standings in opposition to the workers and peasants. The Ashura Declaration does, in the same breath, make a rather unsatisfactory distinction between urban and rural Tanzania as representing exploiters and exploited respectively. It is a socialism of rural development. That stratification on the countryside is also acknowledged, and the realistic assessment is made of African communal societies as it was and as it is becoming. Let me see here. I think that might having extolled the virtues of, okay, I think I'm gonna stop there. That sounds good. I'm probably not great at finding stopping points. But I'll do my best. This looks like a good stopping point. And I'm the and I, like I always do, I'll probably go back a paragraph. So, but yeah. So we talked over about the educational system and how Tanzania is changing that up to best fit the needs of their students, to make sure there's not only the theory but the practice behind it. Now they're talking about villages and how Ujama villages, and trying to get away from the colonial imperialist capitalist mode. And now we're talking about the relations of Ujama socialism in comparison, in contrast to scientific socialism. And then the comparison, the contrast to African socialism, which denies class stratification and a class analysis. Ujama socialism takes in that the class analysis and the stratification of classes. So Ujama is in the realms so far in scientific socialism. But of course, there probably is going to be some form of contradictions within this. So it's good. But yeah, we'll stop right here. We got a long ways to go to get all the way through this. And I think it's going to do a comparison of three things. It's going to do the comparison of scientific socialism compared to Ujama socialism compared to African socialism, which the Nkrumah did fail to recognize class contradictions in a class analysis when it came to Ghana, and was overthrown by the petite bourgeoisie, to come to find out later that he denied class with inside, and he came out with a book called, I think it's called Class with Inside Africa, which is in our server. So he then came out to rectify themselves, to be able to change that position and to rectify himself. We stopped at page 228. But that's it. I was going to. I was just finishing what I was saying. That's depending on the material conditions. If they have productive forces, they have a high rate of peasantry. You start in the countryside. Just like Mao has started in the countryside, having a high peasantry. Because you got to remember, they only pulled very few out of secondary and primary schools. So they denied the productive forces. And in fact, they brought in other people from other countries to do that displacement of African peoples. Hmm? Who's they? Which ones? The colonial educational system or the non-colonial educational system? And what was your question? No, they educated them, but they didn't educate them on their material conditions, on their elements that they live under. They educated them according to European standards and European development. So they didn't develop African children in the African way. They developed the African children in a European way, and then lots of the people from the primary schools, very few graduated to the secondaries, and even less graduated onto the graduate part. And most of them had to go to the other countries, the Western countries, in order to learn and have higher education, which then simulated them into more European standards. So when they came back to their country, because even with that, they weren't even hired on. They came back and they were Europeanized to the fact that they couldn't understand their culture. It was alienated to them. So these colonial education alienated them from children on up to adults. Yep, yep. All right, we're getting close to the end of this book. I like this book. All right, let's look a little bit ahead. It's only 8:01. See what else we have to come across. Just got to finish this. So the next chapter will be class contradictions in Tanzania, concept of class, the process of class formation. So this is where we're going to find out more. This is that what Nkrumah failed at in his first attempt. The structure of working class, the workers and the petty bourgeoisie, and the state. So like Ujamaa is very parallel to scientific socialism. He's trying to say class contradiction. See, yep, this is where he's going to do that. Going to show the distinctions in class stratifications. Conclusion. And then transition. Yeah, we got a long ways to go. It's just fun. All right, you sure you got nothing else? Next time, write them down. And then we can get through them. Because I like questions. Well, kind of like questions. I'm always scared that I can't answer them. Ujamaa Socialism, explain, ask questions. The AI, fucking hell. All right, everybody. Looks like we did pretty good. Thank you for giving out to the refugees. I appreciate that. I try my best to give it back to the refugees as much as possible because I know I get some coins out of this. So I appreciate that. Whoever helped, I think it was you mostly, Joe. Was it? Oh, that's good. I'm glad we got a lot of assistance. That's awesome. But other than that, unless anybody has any questions or anything, I'm going to go ahead and close it out. Go feed Rufus. Doesn't look like anything. All right, everybody.